We've now reached presentation 5 in the series where we're looking at insights from Ezekiel. I've entitled this Idolatry in the Temple. Let's just look back for a moment at chapters 6 and 7 of his book. We saw in the last presentation that in the way they thought at that time, they saw God as sending all the disasters. Now we've got to watch. That's just part of the Hebrew language and thought forms of the day. They couldn't see God as not being in control. And we can learn something from that. But in fact, when you look at the text, what you can see is that the disasters that had come to the people of Judah and were coming, they were the inevitable consequences for the actions of the people of God, the people of Judah. Perhaps it's better to see it that way. The disasters were not created by God. The evil was perpetrated by the Babylonian Empire. And they were very capable of the most barbaric behavior. Two ways of looking at this, but they're roughly equivalent. You could say that God removed his hand of protection over his people, and in this presentation we'll see how that came to be. But equally you could say that the people chose to move away from God's hand of protection. They moved outside the umbrella of God's protection by their choice. Two ways of looking at the same thing. So we've got to be very careful in interpreting it in terms of the culture and thought forms of the day. Phrases like that occur all over the place in chapters 6 and 7. That's what they were doing, especially the leadership classes, including the religious leadership classes. God had effectively been pushed to the margins of life by the ruling elites. When that happens, there is an inevitable outcome. Ethical standards and morality standards start to fall apart. God had created this people of God, rescued them from slavery in Egypt, brought them into being with a land of security in order that they might live lives that reflected God's way under his direction and draw other people groups round about to understand and come to God. The purpose for their existence had vanished because their life standards had fallen apart. Comes back to idolatry, which is the theme of this presentation. When we make anything or anyone more important than God. It could be something good. Could be a hobby. Could be a family. Could be a job. Could be a responsibility. It could also be status and money and possessions. But when we make anything or anyone more important than God, basically that's what you're doing. God's been pushed to the margins of life. We're pursuing our own life direction, and there's an inevitable outcome. God made us, and he knows the best way for life for us. He wants the best for life for us. And when we move away from God, we lose out. So the standards start to fall, and the reason for our existence of people of God has disappeared. Now let's move on into chapters 8 to 11. We're going to take this as a complete group, and I'm going to go through this fairly rapidly. The theme is idolatry. That's anything or anyone at the center of our lives. Idolatry at the heart of the nation. Now Ezekiel had a series of visions, and we've got to interpret them as visions. In the first chapter, chapter 8, the vision of idolatry in the temple, what was actually happening, and the outcome of it. The nation fell apart because God was moving out. There'd been an exile in 598 BC. We're now 6 years on. Leadership, self-appointed leadership, had replaced those who'd been taken in exile, and they were living in delusion. But there was hope for the future. There's a message of hope for the people. And in the visions that Ezekiel gets, it becomes clear to him. So let's start by looking at chapter 8. In the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in my house and the elders of Judah were sitting before me, the hand of the sovereign Lord came on me there. I looked and I saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he was like fire, and from there up his appearance was as bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God he took me to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood, and there before me was the glory of the God of Israel, as in the vision I had seen on the plain. It's dated pretty precisely. 598, Nebuchadnezzar had come in, created havoc on the land, messed up Jerusalem, and took into exile back to Babylon the leaders, the ruling classes that existed in Jerusalem, and put a puppet king on the throne. New leaders appointed themselves. Now we're talking about quite a bit on. It's 6 years on. But it's 14 months after Ezekiel's first vision when he saw this amazing picture of God, and he realized that God was present with him in Babylon. Let's move on. We're talking about a vision. A vision is given to convey meaning. It's like a dream, but while you're awake. And it's given to convey meaning. So let's be cautious in how we interpret it. The meaning is very powerful. Then he said to me, Son of man, look towards the north. So I looked, and at the entrance north of the gate of the altar, I saw this idol of jealousy, something that competed with God. And he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they're doing? The utterly detestable things the Israelites are doing here, things that will drive me far from my sanctuary. God is being driven out. But you will see things that are even more detestable. Then he brought me to the entrance to the court, and I looked, and I saw a hole in the wall. He said to me, Son of man, now dig into the wall. I dug into the wall and saw a doorway there. That word detestable occurs many times. It's a Jewish word that they used for contempt for a heathen deity. Idolatry, anything other than God becoming central in our lives. He said to me, Go in and see the wicked and detestable things they are doing here. So I went in and looked, and I saw portrayed all over the walls all kind of crawling things, unclean animals, and all the idols of Israel. In front of them stood 70 elders of Israel, and Jezaniah son of Shaphan was standing among them. Each had a censer in his hand, and a fragrant cloud of incense was arising. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of Israel are doing in the darkness, each at the shrine of his own idol? They say, The Lord does not see us, the Lord has forsaken the land. And again he said, You will see them doing things that are even more detestable. Idolatry was everywhere, and everyone just did their own thing, and this was in the leadership classes. Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and I saw women sitting there mourning the god Tammuz. He said to me, Do you see this, Son of man? You will see things that are even more detestable than this. He then brought me into the inner court of the house of the Lord, and there at the entrance of the temple, between the portico and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs towards the temple of the Lord. Insult. Their faces towards the east, the rising sun. They were bowing down to the sun in the east, sun worship. He said to me, Have you seen this, Son of man? Is it a trivial matter for the people of Judah to do the detestable things they're doing here? Must they also fill the land with violence and continually arouse my anger? Look at them putting the branch to their nose, therefore I will deal with them in anger. I will not look at them with pity or spare them. Though they shout in my ears, I will not listen to them. You see, when something other than God becomes central, the land becomes filled with violence. Standards and morality fall apart. Everyone's doing their own thing for their own benefit, and it conflicts all over the place. Look at one little sentence we can't be sure exactly what this means. It must be an idiom of the time. But perhaps it's something like thumbing our noses at God. That's certainly what the leadership classes among the people of God were doing. They had decided, they knew what was best, they were doing their own thing, and they'd pushed God to the margins of life. He's going to conduct a tour of the temple, and he sees that there's blatant evil being brought into the temple, the central place for the worship of God in the land of Judah. There are 4 scenes presented to him. Some sort of statue had been erected inside the temple. It was a physical object drawing veneration. They were worshipping the created rather than the creator. And that's the fundamental problem. We worship the created rather than the creator. And we can even worship our own brains and our own abilities, and our own abilities to decide things for ourselves. But when we push God out and make something else our God, human well-being is undermined, because God does know the best way for us. Oh, stop for a minute and think about our modern churches. There are idols, literally, in some of them, but there are many objects that are being venerated. Oh, we have slipped up badly. Second vision. Civic officials, the leaders, indulging in secret pagan activities. They think God can't see them, so they can do what they like. You see, they were worshipping almost anything they wanted to. And that's what's happening in the West. There's a kind of underpinning belief that God has walked out in us and you can't see what we're doing. Yes, there is a God, but he doesn't really care. He's not really involved in life. We've pushed him to the margins of life. In the story that they believe, this God had died. So women were mourning for the death of a God. Make believe, but nonetheless they did it. They were lamenting for the past. And that was replacing worshipping the living God of the present. There's quite a lot of that goes on across many religions. But there's a real danger in Christianity today. The veneration of past figures. Lamentations for the past, wanting to get back to it. All replacing the centrality of God in the here and now. And then we're into things that are close to the occult. Worshipping the sun, which was very common in groups at that time. And occultic worship is all over Western cultures today. King Josiah had been a wonderful reforming king. His life cut short prematurely. He barely reached 40 years of age when he was killed in battle. He instituted major reforms. But as soon as he'd gone, his sons didn't continue it. And the spiritual rot within the people of God was within the people of God, within the nation. It wasn't imposed from outside. And they'd gone far too far. And the whole nation and its culture and society was simply falling apart. The only way to deal with that rot was to cut it out ruthlessly. The temple had to go, the royal family had to go, the leadership class had to go, and an exile for many decades was now important to break the people away from it. And from these exiles, once they'd broken free from it, their descendants, the penny started to drop as to what had been going on. And they were now willing to put things right. Now let's move to chapter 9. Then I heard him call out in a loud voice, "Bring near those who are appointed to execute judgment on the city, each with a weapon in his hand." And I saw 6 men coming from the direction of the upper gate which faces north, each with a deadly weapon in his hand. With them was a man clothed in linen, with a writing kit in his side. They came and stood beside the bronze altar. Now the glory of the Lord God of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim where it had been, and moved to the threshold of the temple, moving from the central position to the edge. Then the Lord called to the man clothed in linen, who had the writing kit at his side, and said to him, "Go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it." There were faithful people. As I listened, he said to the others, "Follow them through the city and kill, without showing pity or compassion. Slaughter the old men, the young men and women, the mothers and children, but do not touch anyone who has the mark. Begin at my sanctuary." So they began with the old men who were in front of the temple. Then he said to them, "Defile the temple and fill the courts with the slain. Go." So he went out and began killing throughout the city. While they were killing and I was left alone, I fell face down, crying out, "Alas, sovereign Lord, are you going to destroy the entire remnant of Israel in this outpouring of your wrath on Jerusalem?" He answered me, "The sin of the people of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. The land is full of bloodshed, and the city is full of injustice." Morality gone. They say, "The Lord has forsaken the land, the Lord does not see." So I will not look on them with pity or spare them, but I'll bring down on their own heads what they've done. Then the man in linen with the writing kit at his side brought back word, saying, "I have done as you have commanded." Notice that God is seen as doing it. The picture that's given is a very accurate picture from this vision of what the Babylonians did to the people of the city of Jerusalem when a few years later they took the city and destroyed it. You see, Ezekiel, part of the Jewish culture, described it as God doing it, but the Babylonians did it. It's a visionary experience. God's presence moves from the inner sanctuary to the threshold. He's just about being eased out and pushed out by the leadership classes. But that means his protection had gone, and the people were now at risk from the Babylonians. Jerusalem was the only major center left from the previous activities of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. It was going to go. But there was protection for those who actively opposed the evils. God is a God of justice. We don't necessarily see the whole thing working out, but it's there. There's a logical progression. Actions have consequences. The people brought it on themselves by their behavior, mainly the leadership classes. And verse 10 captures that. They brought it on themselves. Now from chapter 10, I looked, and I saw the likeness of a throne of lapis lazuli above the vault that was over the heads of the cherubim. Now we're back to the vision that Isaiah's ministry started with, out in the desert in Babylon. The Lord said to the man clothed in linen, "Go in among the wheels beneath the cherubim. Fill your hands with burning coals from among the cherubim. Scatter them over the city." And as I watched, he went in. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar's army razed the city to the ground, burnt it to the ground, smashed it completely. Now the cherubim were standing at the south side of the temple when the man went in, and a cloud filled the inner court. Then the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. The cloud filled the temple, and the court was full of the radiance of the glory of the Lord. The sound of the wings of the cherubim could be heard as far away as the outer court, like the voice of God Almighty when he speaks. Then the Lord commanded the man in linen, "Take fire from among the wheels, from among the cherubim." The man went in and stood beside a wheel. And one of the cherubim reached out his hand to the fire that was among them. He took up some of it and put it in the hands of the man in linen, and took it and went out. Under the wings of the cherubim could be seen what looked like human hands. Then the cherubim rose upwards, carrying the whole presence of God. These were the living creatures I had seen by the river Kibar. When the cherubim moved, the wheels beside them moved, and the cherubim spread their wings to rise from the ground. The wheels did not leave their side. When the cherubim stood still, they also stood still, and when the cherubim rose, they rose with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in them. Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. While I watched, the cherubim spread their wings and rose from the ground, and as they went, the wheels went with them. They stopped at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. These were the living creatures I had seen beneath the God of Israel by the river Kibar, and I realized that they were cherubim. Each had 4 faces and 4 wings, and under their wings was what looked like human hands. Their faces had the same appearance as those I had seen by the river Kibar. Each one went straight ahead. That's one of the saddest comments in the whole of the book. The final tragedy. God abandoned his central position in the life of his people, symbolized by the inner Holy of Holies in the temple. Here symbolized by his presence with this magnificent picture. God was leaving his people because he'd been driven away. God does not force himself on us human beings. He seeks our best and offers us the best. He'd been driven out. What a tragedy. Then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me to the gate of the house of the Lord that faces east. There at the entrance of the gate were 25 men. I saw among them Jezaniah son of Azur and Pelatiah son of Benaiah, leaders of the people. The Lord said to me, Son of man, these are the men who are plotting evil and giving wicked advice in this city. They say, haven't our home houses been recently rebuilt? The city is a pot and we are the meat in it. Therefore prophesy against them. Prophesy, Son of man. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on me, and he told me to say, this is what the Lord says. This is what you're saying, you leaders of Israel. But I know what is going on in your mind, through your mind. You've killed many people in this city and filled its streets with the dead. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. The bodies you've thrown there are the meat, and this city is the pot. But I will drive you out of it. You fear the sword, and the sword is what I will bring against you, declares the sovereign Lord. I will drive you out of the city and deliver you into the hands of foreigners and inflict punishment on you. You will fall by the sword, and I will execute judgment on you at the borders of Israel. Then you will know that I am the Lord. The city will not be a pot for you, and nor will you be the meat in it. I will execute judgment on you at the borders of Israel, and you will know that I am the Lord. For you have not followed my decrees or kept my laws, but have conformed to the standards of the nations around you. What a frightening picture. Let's remind ourselves of the historical facts. Nebuchadnezzar rampaged through the land. After a siege, he took Jerusalem in 598 BC. He took the leadership at that time, and they were deported to Babylon. Among them was Ezekiel. But new self-appointed leadership emerged in the city over the succeeding years. Nebuchadnezzar had put in a puppet king, but the puppet king was weak, didn't really know what way to go or what to do. But these new self-appointed leaders saw themselves as superiors, and they pursued self-interest, and the majority continued to suffer. They saw themselves as the choice meat cuts of the nation. But in fact, the majority suffered at their hands, at the exploitation, at their brutality. God had to intervene. The great theologian said that whereas the upper crust had claimed to be the prime cuts of meat securely stored in a safe place, the city of Jerusalem, Yahweh announces that the leaders are in fact butchers who have made stew out of the citizenry. And that is a vivid and accurate picture of what was actually going on, as historical documents show. And this is supposed to be the people of God. Micah saw it a century or so ago before. Listen, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of Israel. Should you not embrace justice, you who hate good and love evil? That's the leaders who tear the skin from my people and the flesh from their bones. They were robbing people, who eat my people's flesh, strip off their skin and break their bones in pieces. They were making their lives misery, who chop them up like meat for the pan, like flesh for the pot. Same kind of picture. They were doing it then, and Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah. They never listened to Micah, they never listened to Isaiah. And Jeremiah came later. They didn't listen to him either. Ezekiel observes that. Remember, it's a vision. And he prophesies disaster for the leadership elites. Now he observes the death of one of them, Pelatiah. This is kind of representative of what was going to happen. But there's a play on words. Pelatiah, son of Benaiah, these words have meaning. It means Yahweh has delivered, that's Pelatiah. Yahweh has built up Benaiah. Here was a leader, by his life and actions, contradicting the name of himself and his father. Powerful irony hidden in the language. You see, leaders who've got absolute power, and there's a lot of them in the world today, even in Christian groups. Justice vanishes. It blinds them to reality, but God can see what's going on. But when people think they can run their own lives, take their own decisions, plan their own theologies, it cuts us off from God's grace. And God moves out. How tragic. But the chapter finishes with words of hope. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, the people of Jerusalem have said of your fellow exiles and all the other Israelites, they are far away from the land. This land was given to us as our possession. Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, although I sent them far away among the nations and scattered them among the countries, yet for a little while I have been a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you've been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again. This was spoken to the people who had been deported. Nothing to do with end times. We've got to interpret it, and the words make it clear. We've got to interpret it in context. You see, those who were left in Jerusalem, they thought the people who had been deported were deserted by God, because God was the tribal God of Jerusalem. And many of them thought that God would intervene and rescue the temple in Jerusalem. They didn't realize that it was their behavior, what they were doing as leadership class, that was causing the problems. But what God was revealing to Ezekiel was the future lay with a remnant of exiles. In fact, it would be the descendants of those who had been deported and those who were about to be deported. These descendants, the penny would drop. They had to be taken into exile. They had to be deported. They had to be taken away from all the evils of the religious system and political system in Jerusalem. It had to be broken. So the temple went, The city went, the nation went, the royal line went, the ruling classes went. That breakage had to be done so that from those who were deported, the descendants would realize what was going on. They would need a spiritual revolution, and Ezekiel was a major part in that spiritual revolution. And when there was a spiritual revolution, the land would be restored. But not until. And it's speaking to people who were exiles in Babylon and were soon to be exiles in Babylon in the 6th century BC. And you cannot interpret beyond that. They will return to it, as Jerusalem, and remove all its vile images and detestable idols. I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. Then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people and I will be their God. But as for those whose hearts are devoted to their vile images and detestable idols, I will bring down on their own heads what they have done, declares the sovereign Lord. Then the cherubim with the wheels beside them spread their wings, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. The glory of the Lord went up from within the city and stopped above the mountain east of it. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me to the exiles in Babylonia, in the vision given by the Spirit of God. Then the vision I had seen went up from me, and I told the exiles everything the Lord had shown me. God now leaves the city. He left the temple. But he was still in control of the events. Another step in the final tragedy. He moved out of the temple. Now he'd moved out of the land. God's offer, and this is his way always. God's offer to his people was restoration back in the land, so that they could live quality lives and make an impact on the people groups around. But that involved the establishment of an entirely new order. The entire temple system had to go. The royal line had to go. The ruling classes had to go. The religious leadership had to go. The people had to learn to depend on the inner resources that God would provide for them. There are conditions to getting the land back. And it took quite a while for the exiles being deported to Babylon and their descendants to begin to understand this and to take on board what they had done, or their forebears had done, and to learn, to listen, to be ready, as it were, to start again. Centuries later, from that nation, Jesus was born. And godly men and women had scattered from the nation throughout the Roman Empire by the natural processes of movement. And they were carrying with them God's ways. And they were making an impact on the people of the Roman Empire. Yes, small, but it was there. And it was from many of these groups that people like Paul in his travels brought people through to the completion of the story. They came to be followers of Jesus and to live the Jesus way, enabled by all that Jesus had done for them in his life, death, and resurrection. That's God's offer, but it requires a response. It's not imposed on us. We've got to respond to what God is saying. It means a removal of the sources of evil in the nation. And all that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army had done to sack the temple in Jerusalem and get rid of the ruling classes, that was a step on the road. But they had to take a decision and a commitment to do it God's way. God's way is the best way. We get fulfilled living. That leads to peace, security. We're then equipped to be able to help others, to bless them, to show something of all that God can be for humanity. But it requires our response. And Ezekiel gives a warning. Those who choose not to respond, we're back to the same principle. Actions have consequences. Now, there was a tragic outcome in the days of Jesus. The religious leadership of that day collaborated with the political overlords, the Romans, to try and destroy Jesus by having him tortured to death on a Roman cross. They refused to respond to what God was doing. They went back to the ways of evil, and they paid a terrible consequence for their decisions. Because in AD 70, the Romans sacked the city, and the suffering of the people, it was Rome's most violent and vicious campaign ever. The suffering of the people was horrendous. Response is necessary to get peace, security, and blessing. And it illustrates an important principle. God does it for us, his offer. We must respond. We decide. We want to go God's way. Now, we may not know exactly what that involves. We're certainly not very able and capable of following it through, but we make a commitment, a decision. We decide we want to go that way. God then provides the resources by his Holy Spirit in New Testament terms to enable us to carry through what we've committed ourselves to carry through. And that is a message for us today in our Christian communities. We need to look at what we're doing, and we need to remove ruthlessly all the things that are getting in the way of God's purposes, that are not his will, not his plan. Look at the things in your own church life and say, did Jesus mandate that? Did Jesus ask us to do this? Many things that are being done bear no relationship to what Jesus actually taught and commissioned. We just accept it, church teaching. We accept it from authority figures. We have to remove the sources of evil amongst our community. We decide to commit ourselves to go God's ways, the ways of Jesus, to live his way, his quality of life by his grace, by his strength, by his inner resources of the Spirit. God enables, but we have to decide. That is a great and deep message from the prophecy of Ezekiel. God set up a covenant with them when he rescued them from Egypt. Jeremiah pictures it. They will be my people and I will be their God. It's the same picture that Ezekiel has here. and I will rejoice in doing them good, and will assuredly plant them in this land with all my heart and soul. He's speaking of the return from the exile, nothing more. We're the in group. We've got it right. What's more, the group down the road hasn't. Easy to claim. That's the touchstone for us today. It was the touchstone in the days of Ezekiel. The life quality, particularly the leadership, then the people, reflecting the ways of God, the life quality that Jesus showed us. Nobody's special. Nobody's got it all right. But we commit ourselves to live the Jesus way. And again, going back to the great theologian, and this is worth pondering, true spirituality is not exercised by claiming the promises of God or parroting theological dogma. There are a lot of promises being claimed without looking at the conditions attached. A lot of theological dogmas being pronounced. Cuts no ice, and cuts no ice with God. Where is the life quality of Jesus? That's the evidence. That's the challenge. That's the way ahead. The next presentation, we're going to look at the exile, the next deportation that was coming.